The events of the God Valley incident in One Piece is one of the most anticipated flashbacks in the entire story that fans have been waiting for since chapter 957. But thanks to the recent events of the current flashback in the story, a lot of One Piece fans have begun to realize that the catalyst of the God Valley incident may have been Shaki, this legendary female pirate that all of the male pirates were after. That was until the recent chapter, chapter 1158, alluded to something more on God Valley that would be the real catalyst of the incident. And although this chapter only very vaguely talks about this hidden catalyst, I think I've truly figured out what God Valley was really about. Saint Figureland Garling and the world government found the Fountain of Youth, the second most legendary treasure in One Piece, behind the One Piece itself. It may sound ridiculous that this was the reason why God Valley happened, and it may sound ridiculous that this even exists in the One Piece world in the first place, but by the end of this video, you will totally agree with me that the Fountain of Youth exists in One Piece, and it is located on God Valley. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe, and let's get into it. Now, the crux of this theory is, of course, this conversation that Garling has with the Gorosei 2 years before the events of God Valley. To sum it up, Garling is asking the Gorosei to host another hunting game, which is where the world government and the celestial dragons would go and hunt slaves for points, leading to various prizes, as of course we saw in the Kuma flashback, and the Gorosei tell Garling that he is too hasty as they just hosted one of these events. However, Garling says on an unrelated mission, he found a non-affiliated island, meaning an island that is not affiliated with the world government, and claims that not only did they have abundant resources, but they also found an outrageous discovery on this island. And of course, as we know, this would lead to the God Valley incident happening 2 years after this conversation. There are other subtle hints in this conversation that may hint at the Fountain of Youth being located on God Valley, but before we get to those, let's jump to the first piece of evidence that the Fountain of Youth is located on God Valley. At the end of this chapter, it is revealed that Garling's kids, Shanks and Shamrock, were born on God Valley, a year before the event. On the surface, it may just look like Garling found a woman when he was on his unrelated mission and found this island in the first place. However, if you know anything about history in the real world, it is very common for conquerors and oppressive colonizers to have kids in the place that they will eventually take over to establish roots in whatever they're trying to oppress. To me, this is very obviously an act of Garling trying to already place his influence on the island of God Valley, which implies an insane level of significance in this island. Because every time we've seen Garling in this story, he's a very power-hungry man, so for Garling to go out of his way to establish his roots and his bloodline on this island already means it is something that he definitely wants. As we now know, Garling in the current events of the story is a Gorosei member, which may be hinting at his obsession with immortality and his need for the Fountain of Youth, but instead of making that leap, let's just say this signifies that God Valley was extremely important to Garling, so important that he would have his kids here to establish a connection to the island. However, you could just chalk this up to the abundant resources on the island and the fact that it's a non-affiliated state, so Garling having his kids here was just a way to connect this island to the world government. So let's jump to the second piece of evidence that God Valley hosts the Fountain of Youth. We'll go back to this conversation that Garling was having with the Gorosei. The most potent line in this set of dialogue, and probably the reason why the Gorosei agreed to host a hunting game on God Valley in the first place, is that Garling says the Great One will surely be pleased with it. Of course, Garling is talking about Imu here, as there is no other character he could be referring to, so whatever is significant about God Valley has to be something that would please Imu of all people. Which of course, as of recently in the Elbaf manga, we have learned not much pleases Imu. Because we've had such limited time to examine Imu's character, there's not a lot to go off of here, but also for that same reason, it makes every scene we've had with Imu all the more important. And of course, one of the most jarring scenes we've had with Imu is Imu's obsession with Vivi and Lily. How do Vivi and Lily have anything to do with the potential Fountain of Youth, you may ask? Well, I know we're starting to get into a theory inside of a theory category, but a lot of people have speculated that because Imu is almost confirmed to be immortal, they possess or live inside of Lily's body, the Queen of Alabasta from 800 years ago, because the Queen never made it home from her journey away from the Holy Land. We don't know the specific details of how Imu is immortal, whether it's from the immortality surgery that Law's devil fruit is capable of, or if Imu is some kind of devil. Regardless, it's very possible that Imu needs a host body in order to remain immortal, and this could be the exact reason why Imu needs Vivi's body, because Lily's body is starting to deteriorate, and Imu needs a new host to maintain that immortality. We have of course seen Imu's obsession with Vivi in the current day story, but that's all to say, if Imu has this obsession with immortality and this need to reign over the world forever, one of the few things that would greatly please this character who's seemingly angry all the time is the Fountain of Youth. It seems that Garling is extremely confident that whatever he found at God Valley would please Imu, so I think this could very likely be the case, as I can't really think of anything else, something as trivial as abundant resources and an unaffiliated nation pleasing the Great One. But if all of this speculative evidence is not enough for you to believe that the Fountain of Youth is on God Valley, or that it even exists in One Piece in the first place, let's get into the real heavy hitters as for the evidence that it exists in the story. We've already talked about how Shanks was born on this island, and how it's possible that Garling chose this island for his kids to be born, so he could remain having heavy ties to God Valley. But that's not the only implication that Shanks being born on this island has for this theory. If you remember all the way back in chapter 434, when Shanks goes to meet Whitebeard, Shanks talks about bringing him some sort of drink from his hometown in the West Blue. Now, a lot of us thought this might have been a retcon because we then learned that Shanks was actually from the Holy Land, but as of this chapter, we know Shanks actually is from the West Blue because God Valley is in the West Blue and this is where Shanks was born. But that's not what's important here. What's important is what Shanks says to Whitebeard when he brings this jug of liquid. There are multiple interpretations of this translation, but Shanks says that he brings medicinal water or healing water to Whitebeard as a gift when he visits Whitebeard's boat. At the time, we just thought this was a kind gesture because Whitebeard was in his final days, but now that we know this water is from Shanks' hometown, God Valley, could this water have literally been water from the Fountain of Youth, a healing water meant to help Whitebeard recuperate his strength before Marineford? And that's not the only thing unique about this interaction. Shanks is here in the first place to warn Whitebeard about Blackbeard. How does that relate, you might ask? Well, I know this is a stretch, but now because we know that Blackbeard is the son of Rocks, and Shanks very likely knows this, him coming to visit Whitebeard, holding the liquid that very likely caused the God Valley incident in the first place, an incident where Rocks was a major player at, could have been a roundabout way of warning Whitebeard about Rocks' son, alluding to the fact that the threat of this dangerous bloodline is still out there. Or even more crazily, a lot of people have suggested that the reason Blackbeard is able to possess 2 devil fruits, and the reason that he doesn't sleep at night, is because Rocks still exists in Blackbeard's soul. So if Shanks was aware of this, Shanks was scarred by Blackbeard after all, him bringing the very immortality water that Rocks sought after on God Valley, again could be a way of alluding to Whitebeard that Rocks was still out there. However, this would only make sense if Rocks has even greater ties to the Immortality Water or the Fountain of Youth located on God Valley, but when you think about it, that might make even more sense. Right at the beginning of the Rocks flashback, we have learned that Rocks already had a run-in with Imu, yet backed down despite making it all the way to the garden room in Marijoa. Why would someone so keen and so bent on destroying the world government make it all the way to the king of the world and back down at the last moment? Well, I think it's very likely that Rocks himself experienced the immortality that Imu possesses in this encounter and realized that there was nothing he could do, exactly like the narrator says in this scene. So, what would the natural course of action be? Rocks would likely look for a way to make himself immortal to make the playing field even so he could eventually go back to fight Imu like he promised. And of course, if he found out that the Fountain of Youth, the source of immortality, was on God Valley itself, then of course he would go raid the island at the first chance he got, which then of course we know has already happened at the God Valley incident. Previously, we all thought that the God Valley incident was caused by the kidnapping of Shaki, who has been dubbed the crown jewel of Pirate Island, the exact same thing that Garp says was stolen from Pirate Island that caused the God Valley incident in the first place. And while I still think Shaki was kidnapped, and is probably the reason why the Roger Pirates went to God Valley, we see in this chapter that Rocks has already found a lover, as dictated by Shaki, which makes total sense in the timeline because Blackbeard is about to be born. So if Rox really isn't obsessed with Shaki anymore, that wouldn't be the primary reason why Rox went to God Valley. Instead, it would make a lot more sense if he was seeking after that immortality, the one he absolutely required to go head on head with Imu. And if that's not enough to convince you, there is one more piece of evidence that I think ties into almost every One Piece theory that actually was referenced in this chapter: the legendary One Piece song, Bink's Sake. There have been multiple theories that Bink's Sake leads to the One Piece, or tells the tales of Joy Boy from the Void Century, so it is undoubtedly true that Bink's Sake is an important song filled with foreshadowing. And of course, there are multiple moments where this song is sung that have no greater significance in the story. However, I thought Oda's inclusion of Bink's Sake in this chapter to be a little bit weird. Why dedicate one panel to just the Roger pirates docked at Pirate Island singing Bink's Sake for no reason? Well, I think it could potentially be to remind the readers of the song's significance and how related it is to a bunch of different events in the One Piece world. So how does it relate to the Fountain of Youth and Immortality? Well, not only is Bink's Sake itself a liquid, so the Bink's Sake reference in this song could literally be the Immortality water or the Fountain of Youth. There is also a line in the directly translated version of Bink's Sake that translates to "never ending, ever wandering, our funny traveling tale." Now, although this interpretation is loose and could be hinting towards many different things, I think the term never ending as well as the term ever wandering could heavily be related to immortality, once again the Fountain of Youth or the Immortality water located on God Valley. Lastly, I just want to mention the possibility that this could be the moment that granted the God's Knights immortality. Although I think Imu and the Gorosei have been immortal from the very start, considering they are the same age in this chapter that they are in the very present day of One Piece, I think it's possible that this source of immortality could be the first instance of the God's Knights gaining immortality, or at least an extension of Imu's power, because prior to this point we have not seen any of the God's Knights fight and display their immortality yet. We've only seen that in the present day story, so this could be a reason why Garling was heavily pushing towards obtaining this power, because the God's Knights were not yet immortal. But regardless of if that's true or not, I think if you put everything together, it really just clicks. Garling finds God Valley and locates the Fountain of Youth, realizes how significant it could be, so he has 2 kids on this island to make sure he's constantly tied to God Valley. He pushes the world government to have another hunting game here because Imu would be pleased with the immortality located on God Valley, as Lily's body is deteriorating, and because Vivi has not been born yet, Imu is still looking for a way to retain their immortality. We've already seen this immortality water, or the water from the Fountain of Youth, when Shanks brings water from his hometown, which we now know as God Valley, to help heal Whitebeard and warn him about Blackbeard, the son of Rox, who was hunting after this very water that Shanks possesses in this scene, the very water, or booze, that Bink's Sake is referencing in the song that is referenced again in this chapter. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe. Let me know if this theory is way too crazy for One Piece, or if it could possibly come true. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.